Hello, and welcome to the Digital Indigenous Storytelling Project. In this series, we will be interviewing Indigenous individuals who live in Missouri and having them share a story about themselves and their culture. My name is Eric Pinto. I'm Choctaw, Mississippi, and Zuni of New Mexico, and a project coordinator for the Catherine M. Booter Center of American Indian Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. In this segment, I'll be interviewing Neil Lawhead. Neil, thank you for participating in this project and sharing your life experiences and culture with us. Can you go ahead and start us off with a little background introduction about yourself?
Sure. I'm 42 years old here in 2020, and grateful that I got the opportunity to meet you and the work of your center and what you're doing here for not only Indian folks, but also non-Indians around the state, and be able to understand a little bit about what being Indian is and all the nuances and the fun that comes with it. So thank you again.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so can you tell us a little bit about, your cultural heritage, your tribal affiliation, and where you live at, and, what you're doing and where you live at?
Yeah, absolutely. I must probably start on a early spring morning in April 1978. I was born. I'm sure the birds were singing and everything was rejoicing. But for me, it was a pretty special day. I was born here in Kansas City, Missouri, and I was promptly put up for adoption. So I ultimately was born as a baby boy, and then made my first placement into a foster home where they named me Billy Jack. So as known from the hospital to the social workers to the courts, they said that I was Indian, and that little family had found that movie real popular at the time. So that was my first name after baby boy was Billy Jack, and then soon was linked up with a family, Lee and Nancy Lawhead, here in the Kansas City area, and was adopted and placed and adopted with them. And my tribal identity and affiliation is an ongoing and evolving conversation. But when I was born, I was just Indian. That's what they called me. They didn't have any real specific tie to that, as if it was all the same thing. And they placed with my dad, who was of Cherokee descent, the Lawhead family, and got the opportunity through them to attend my very first dance that was actually in my honor here in the Kansas City area. When they brought me home, the community around had a powwow at Bob Blues for me as a newborn infant. So I've been active and involved and considered Indian my whole life, and took on my dad's tribe, Pamunkey Cherokee. At the time, Pamunkey tribe in Virginia was state recognized. Now they're federally recognized. And the Cherokee Nation out of Oklahoma, where a lot of Lawheads and On the Hills and other folks come from. So our family was involved that way. And throughout my life, I kind of grew up and became related, adopted in and put up with by a number of different folks from a number of different tribes. And one of those tribes was the Ottawa tribe of Oklahoma. And my whole life, I was adopted in and called one of their own and named that way and recognized by the chief at the time and a couple chiefs since as a member of the community, but not bona fide, not card carrying CVIB Indian. So as that story continues to unfold, I'm sure I'll get into that at some point, but biological families had reached out and made contact with me, and it had turned out that the belief is that I come from the Kiowa and Comanche tribes of Oklahoma, and so I have relationships with those tribes, Kiowas, the Comanches, the Ottawas, the Cherokees, and then ultimately I was a foster parent, adoptive parent here in Missouri as well for two Indian children who are Ponca and Chippewa of Nawash. So in our house we have all those tribes that kind of combine in. And I'm married, my wife Tinley, for almost 20 years now. We've been married and we have 4 kids between us, 2 girls, Mari and Ava, and Jake and Jace, our 2 sons. So, as time goes on, I'll probably talk more and more about them. I have a real deep love for my children, but a real, I guess, understanding of how important community and having a tribe is, whether you're Indian or not. But when you're Indian, that whole definition of tribe and everything else it's a deep and complicated but beautiful story. And just grateful that I've been accepted as and worked through and in and with, and been Indian my whole life. So I should probably introduce myself by my Indian name, which is Pushkwadashi. And just really grateful that I've had all the experiences in my life that have led me to, be a part of this culture, and just the little bits that I've got exposed to has shown so much value and wisdom. And when it comes down to it, I do the best I can to represent the tribes that I'm affiliated with. And in a lot of cases, I've got family around in different tribes, from Choctaw to Creek to Sisseton, Wahpeton. There's just a lot of different folks in Indian country. And so it's a small world, and not all that surprising that my biological family found me, as I really was never lost. They knew where I was and who I was. So kind of an interesting backstory, but at this point, I live in Liberty, Missouri, and I work for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and an agency called the Administration for Children and Families. Within that agency, I work as a tribal child and family program specialist, focusing in on child welfare, safety, permanency, and well-being of Indian children. Work with the tribes in our regional area and across the nation to help develop their foster care and fund some of their services and supports. And really appreciate, like I said, this opportunity to collaborate with the university and your center to maybe just share a little bit. So again, I just appreciate you guys reaching out and the work that you've done to identify those of us living here in Missouri. So as kind of a lifelong resident of Missouri, I've been around long enough to really understand things that took place in a number of different generations, and grateful that maybe just a little bit of that could come out here today.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all that. Yeah, and you bring up a couple different areas that I definitely want to ask more about. The first one being, you talked about having connections to multiple tribes within, yourself, and then with the family. How have you connected, with those tribes? In what ways have you connected with those tribes, for yourself and, within the family too?
Well, it's really interesting. In a lot of different circumstances, those connections have come really naturally. And when, like I said, my first dance, I was just an infant brought in a blanket, and they were dancing for me. And as time went on, my understanding of that dance that they had for me was my auntie, my mom, Idona Powell. It was Blue at the time. Was really close with my sister from my Comanche, well, from my Kiowa side, and it was so close that my sister was helping set up for that dance. And then there was an emergency back home with her husband, and they had to go back to Pawnee, Oklahoma. So just in that one instance, there was Kiowa, Comanche, there were Choctaws. Those were the ones that were all working. A couple Osages and some Prairie Band and some other different tribes around. So my connections started before I even did. And there was a path made for me in a lot of different ways that I didn't do anything for. And when they brought me home, it was my dad's work through the Kansas City Heart of America Indian Center back in the 70s, where he supported the community work, but he was also working within the Administration for Native Americans at the federal level and helping tribes deal with the administration of being a tribe, and was even helping some of the tribes that had been terminated be recognized as valid nations. So, a lot of this centers down on federal policy and how people came to Kansas City in the first place, or St. Louis. And that's where the initial connections began, was Troy and Jody Littleaxe up here in Kansas City, and the Tyner and Blaylock families. Sally Blaylock, a good grandma of mine, she was living up in this area, her and her husband and her kids. And my dad was going down to Oklahoma to dances when he got back from Vietnam. And his little brother had gone to some of those dances as well. And so he just started connecting there and had connections here. And lo and behold, some of the Kansas City people were connected in Oklahoma where we were going. So a lot of the people that I grew up with here in Kansas City, I would drive all the way to Oklahoma, and then that's when I'd hang out with them. I wouldn't hang out with them up here in Kansas City. We would see each other in Oklahoma, or they would move back home. So we did a lot of traveling, a lot of connections made through different powwows and stomp dances and the American church meetings and hand games and different gatherings like that we would be a part of. But it's usually always tied to connections and family and people that we know. So we used to go over to St. Louis to the barracks, and there'd be dances over that way. And a lot of Kiowas over there, a lot of other tribes that would make their way because a lot of people were relocated to Missouri, either Kansas City or St. Louis in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So there was a pretty established community, although it was really still tribal. And a lot of the connectivity was made in the city, and then they would go back home, and it would be a whole different other kind of connection. So it's the duality of living in Missouri is the homelands, even though we're living on Indian land, like people lived here. We always have to go home. So, there's still family that I have here in Kansas City that I see in Oklahoma, and I don't see them in Kansas City. So, that's where a lot of those connections came from and went to, and just being in that arena and that way of life where, powwows and even ceremonial dances are a big part of our year. So there's a lot of good opportunities that's been had where people from Oklahoma or Kansas or Nebraska, they would all come down this way. Even Iowa would come down this way and enjoy our dances here in Kansas City that used to take place over years and years and years. But because of, a number of different things, there's been ebbs and flows of activities in the Missouri Indian community. And there's always something going on, but it doesn't mean that everybody's connected and it's at large scales. A lot of times it's individual families and groups of people that get together. But we do have some good dances that do take place in the state and or close to. So there's good opportunities to connect even today.
Awesome. So then, you spoke about like the American Indian Center. So for people that aren't familiar with the American Indian Center, like my parents told me like there used to be one here in St. Louis. And then, speaking with you and, a couple other individuals I know out in Kansas City, there's one out there. Can you kind of tell the audience, explain, what does the American Indian Center provide, for everyone?
Yeah. The origins of the Indian Center, the Urban Indian Center, really go back before we document a lot of different things, because the ability for Indian people to support one another and unify was not something that just began in the 60s. There were a lot of connections and informal networks of support for tribal people in the cities, but it wasn't ever formalized. And in many, many different areas of the state, didn't recognize any Indian people even existing because Missouri didn't have tribes. So since no tribes were headquartered or located in Missouri, it was almost like a not applicable mark on many of the census and voting rights, just a lot of different things, even to a point that some of our leaders in the community that were, here in the past, they grew up and identified as Mexican because that was in the communities that they lived in. And those were people that were in certain ways kind of more tribal as well. And it was a border that wasn't ours to begin with. So the difference between a Mexican and Indian is a line on a map and some colonization that took place. So that's really where an invisible population started coming into, more insight, especially when you look around Missouri and, the state's named an Indian word, and we've got towns and areas of the state that recognize its Osage and Oto and different roots that were here before statehood. So it wasn't until the 1940s, after World War II, in the 1950s, that they were terminating tribes at the federal level in terms of saying you no longer exist as a tribe and our treaties are no longer valid. It started in a path where they started trying to also offer Indian people ways to leave the reservation and get out. So a lot of our Indian people showed up in Kansas City and St. Louis because those were places that tribes were relocating people across the nation. I say tribes, but it was really the Bureau of Indian Affairs, now the Department of the Interior, which began as the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Department of War. So as you look through this through a lens, you could think of some of the similarities to other people that have come in contact and been prisoner of war or been, in the case of our Indian people, sovereign nations where they signed a treaty and a truce and agreements. And when that wasn't working, and assimilation and Indian Reorganization Act in the 20s, and that stuff didn't necessarily take place, they started, terminating tribes and trying to disperse Indians. They were also taking Indian children out of homes and adopting them to non-Indian homes as a way to, kill the Indian, save the man. So through that process and that time, urban Indian centers became a part of the war on poverty. And certain areas received funding in order to provide services to transplanted Indian people. So some of that funding came through that way. Some of it comes in through private sources and some other governmental grants, some Indian Health Service work, some really unique and awesome things are taking place at a lot of Indian centers. Here in Missouri, we have the Kansas City Indian Center that started as the Heart of America Indian Center. And before that, there was some kind of council fires that really just started as families helping people when they'd come in town. And, folks would come in off the reservation and show up in town at somebody's door and didn't have nothing. So, some of these families would open the doors, open their homes up, and they finally said, we need to do more than just, Band-Aid stuff. We need to be there to help them. So that's where the Indian Center got established, I think in 1971 here in Kansas City. And there's Indian Center also in St. Louis for a period of time. There was Indian Center in Springfield that I don't believe receives a massive amount of governmental funding, but had started a kind of a nonprofit support in the southwest region of Missouri. And there's also Indian centers in Wichita, Kansas, and definitely Indian Center up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Denver and Chicago. So a lot of different areas have that history of having Indian Center and urban Indians with kind of a special place for services and supports, especially since a lot of the things that our folks deal with are no different than some of the things that non-Indians face, but they're coming from a whole different other place. And a lot of people will have zero understanding about, boarding schools and adoptions and the need for the Indian Child Welfare Act and other different things like that. So they just kind of think of it as a social club, or whereas Indian people are the most heavily regulated people almost anywhere. So there's just a lot of nuances and work that needs to be taken care of, and they serve a really good purpose in a lot of good ways. So we're real supportive of them. But within everything, it takes a community and collaboration and owners from the community to step forward. So it's a continual fight to make sure that things are stable and working well, and really pleased with what's going on here in Kansas City, making it through hurdles and continuing to put services and efforts out there, and even expanding work into place close to my heart, Indian child welfare.
Yeah, well said on explaining what the Indian Center kind of does for natives that live in an urban community, because everyone it's different. You got a smaller population of native people that exist within a city, and they could be possibly far away from their tribes and their communities. So this provides essentially a community of multiple tribes, and like you said too, it also provides services and resources to those people if they need something that they may not receive in a typical hospital or some other type of program setting. Yeah, because I think many people they don't realize that from an indigenous perspective, things, the way we've been taught and the way we look at things can be different. Like you said, we have similarities, but also at the same time too, it's we also have our own differences.
You're exactly right. And I think it's some of those differences and those inherent biases that jump in before we can say hello correctly. So in a lot of cases, the outside world doesn't know how to say hello to us. And in a lot of cases, we don't know how to say hello to each other. So I'm trying to figure out the best way to say that, the cultural connections that can be gained at places like the Indian Center are a double-edged sword, because there's a lot of the definition of Indian can be broken down politically or culturally. And even within the cultural definitions of it, it makes a difference of what family you come from and what your clan is, or what your role is for your community, for your tribe. When we're here in Missouri, it's kind of difficult for a tribe to feel like it has formed, because there are so many different challenges and differences. The fact is, so many people claim they're Indian that we should have zero issues getting things passed in Congress that support tribal rights. But the reality is that idea of what Indian isn't for community definition. It's to be defined by that community, that tribe, those people. And a lot of times that step is forgotten. So I'm real careful highlighting the positives about being Indian in Missouri because of so many different tribes, when at the same breath, those things back home mean something. So, there's a duality. So there's also, living in two worlds, they say, being Indian, living in a non-Indian world. Well, I don't know how you do that, because like my Heights, Chris White, Shawnee man from Oklahoma, says, I don't know how to walk in two worlds. I'm Shawnee in both worlds. There's no two worlds about. I've only got 2 feet, and they're both here, and it's real difficult to say something like you can peel off one world from the other. Well, in that same breath, when you're in urban center or off reservation or away from the keepers of some of those things, when it comes out, may not necessarily be handled with the same kind of respect, or even if it's respectful, it's not appropriate one way or the other. So, I think in certain cases, the connections that we make here in Missouri are meaningful, but they're also tied to our connections back on our reservations or within our homelands, or where our medicines are. And it has led itself for there to be trouble in people agreeing and working together. But in the same breath, it has also created beautiful unions and projects and events. So I think it's all a part of the bigger story in terms of recognizing the value of each culture, recognizing the story behind every person's journey, and then connecting that back to our unity as Indian people, and being able to recognize, in this house, we've got 5 different tribes represented. And what does that mean when it comes to what people think about Indian policy? That means all of our 5 tribes have a different stake and a different viewpoint, and a different understanding, and that's just within our own bodies. So, I think at some level we're going to have to rely upon our language, our culture, our life, our way of living for these next generations to come, whether you're on reservation or off. Because as data points out, most of Indian people live off reservation at this point. And Missouri, although has no tribes, there are tribes that own land in Missouri, and there are also other offices like tribal legislative representative offices that are in the state for different tribes around the country. And as I tried to highlight before, the government to government relationship in cases of like the Indian Child Welfare Act means that those connections to those sovereign nations are more than just, cultural or heritage. It is an active and living political entity and culture that has standing at the highest law in the land when it comes to treaties and our Constitution. So,
yeah, let's discuss a little bit about that. I think, in Missouri, and you kind of mentioned too, is that we as Indigenous people, there's a lack of education. There's the issue of invisibility of Indigenous people, especially in Missouri. And what you're doing with trying to help, Indian children, get adopted to Indian families. Can you explain, about that? Like, why is this, like an issue? And, I think some people would think like, well, shouldn't, a child just go to just any family? Can you explain, everything about that?
Yes, in one way. Yes, in one way, and no in another. I retract from that question at some level because of my current job and wanting to make sure that I don't intermix my own personal feelings with my role in the federal government. So I'm not here representing my work or anything. And in fact, in thinking back on it, I probably shouldn't have given specifics about my work. I in general work for a federal agency that works with tribes and states dealing with foster care, adoption, guardianship, and things like that. So I'm going to politely sidestep a lot of the political and things going around my mind about the Indian Child Welfare Act and just talk a little bit about the need to make sure that the spirit of why we're all here is respected. And things like the Indian Child Welfare Act put requirements and have the states and the tribes work as equals, where the tribe has the opportunity and the ability to transfer jurisdiction back to tribal court and be able to take care of situations like abuse and neglect as a nation. My feeling and my understanding is that our Indian people are citizens of the U.S. government, of the state that they reside in, and of their tribe. And I'm not asking anybody to take a hierarchy approach to what comes first. That is a personal discussion and how people are connected to their tribe, their state, and their government. Where I'm at, though, is that all three entities have a responsibility to support one another to help this child. And the statistics that I don't even agree with, because it's hard to figure out how many kids were actually being stolen from Indian homes and adopted out to non-Indian homes. They said, 6 out of 10 Indian children were done that way, and I've seen other studies that say much higher. I think the bottom line is those connections and those realities are that way because of our history as a government, a history of people interacting and not respecting one another. So, I think in the work that we do currently, it is to make sure that everybody understands that we're all here in support of that child, that family, and that there's not a question about who owns what, that everybody is respected. Within that respect, Indians have a real, unique, special place that is embedded within the Constitution, the many different federal regulations as to Indians can do this and not do this. For a period of time, the Court of Indian Offenses made dancing, our cultural, just even social dancing, outlawed, go to jail, be killed for that. And that wasn't a long time ago. It was 1900s this stuff was going on. And Indian people weren't citizens until the 1920s, and voting wasn't secured until we're still looking in certain areas to make sure that we're connected and working just right within our collaboration for children and families that way. So, I think if I can do anything, it's to highlight the fact that our hope, my personal hope, is that we don't need to work on jurisdictional issues when it comes to removing kids and adopting them out. My hope is that we work with the families to heal what is causing all of the trauma that is breaking apart Indian families to begin with. So, if our families suffer issues, we should also be very, very aware that some of our families are leaders in their field, and doctors and lawyers and senators and representatives, and Dr. Ponkawi Victors, grew up in Wichita, Kansas, and spent a lot of time over here in Missouri. Still to this day, we'll see her up here in Missouri for one thing or another, and recognize that she's just the next generation of leaders that have made their mark on many different positions in state government and federal government, even globally and internationally. I've got a sister, Lydia Horner, Cherokee girl that is from up here in Kansas City, but she lives in Oklahoma now and works for Cherokee Nation Industries globally, and has phone calls and staff and working around the world on behalf of the Cherokee Nation and some of their different work that they're doing. So when it comes down to it, I don't think we've quite defined what being Indian does mean and where the limitations are. And the sad reality is that a lot of it was established, in my opinion, to end the relationship with indigenous people. And as time goes on, just like the code talkers and, the Navajos, they get a lot of play and they did some amazing stuff. But, my Comanches, they had code talkers, they're code talkers from 20, 30 different tribes that helped this government. World War I, II, and I would be surprised if it wasn't happening now. In a lot of ways, the story's not written. It's not over. It's not done. And everything that we do here in this house, we're trying to think 7 generations down. Grandpa Charlie Dawes, Ottawa tribe, he said that. You start matching that with, Cheever's Coffee, who spent a lot of time up this way, working with Native youth and different folks around, always talked about how important it is to make relationships, make friendships, make connections. You never know where that's going to go. And from my end, some of those things have taken me to DC and other places, but some of the places that I've gained the best education has been right in a family's living room, right in a hospital bed, where we end up burning cedar and saying prayers at Truman Medical Center, because we're facing the untimely or tragic circumstances that go around that every family ends up knowing about. But that just because you know about it doesn't mean that you handle it the same way. In a lot of cases, our ceremonies and the things that we need to be healthy are not available to us in this geographic area. So it makes a unique balance of trying to be an Indian, living in this kind of world that we do, where even the definition of success does not include the things that would define me as successful within my tribes.
Yeah. And kind of going off like what you were just saying too, you said like not being successful with your tribe. So like, I mean, you kind of discussed like, working with the tribes, that, you're affiliated with. And so do you feel like there's more more to be built on top of what you're doing? Like you feel like, there's just not enough done.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with not messing up what's been put down before us.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of cases, there have been a lot of prayers, a lot of efforts put down on this journey that I'm on, and in this work that we're doing between our tribes and our communities, and even between my own children and their tribes. It gets to a point where I feel like I'm just getting started. And what needs to be done is to say hello correctly. And like I said, in so many different areas, we just jump in, we're married, and then we date. And that's kind of what we've had to do as Indian people. Is we've been here all along. We weren't not here. In a lot of cases, the whole reason why towns were established was because we helped, or they saw that that's where we were doing things. We had different places around here. I can't tell you how many different tribes walked through here on their own Trail of Tears to Fort Leavenworth, and what kind of situations that they faced when they got to there, and where some people chose, like Shawnee Mission Indian School right here in the Kansas City area. They wanted their kids to get that kind of support, but they didn't really understand that they were giving their kids away, and that they would become hired slave labor for Jackson family and the Johnson family. And so it's just my understanding that, each different tribe and each different family within that tribe has their own stories.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I don't think has been done is the stories haven't been translated in ways that it can affect policy and systems.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of trying to force things through philosophical ways, I think it gets down to not overlooking the families and the children right there. And if there's ways that we can collaborate and work together, then we should, or we should learn how to respectfully not get in the way of each other. So it's an interesting discussion when it comes to how we work as Indian people, as a community, and come together when we're divided and conquered in so many different ways by blood quantum. And I'm actually a supporter of blood quantum, but it doesn't mean that that is the end all be all for how we work together and move forward. And I think my grandparents and our great grandparents and those ones that came before, they recognized that there would be differences, and this whole world was not exactly the same, but we had different roles in it. So I'm a big believer that the role of the indigenous person is nowhere near ending. It's just beginning when it comes to this phase of our existence here in this land and this time. So I hope within some corner of the mind somewhere that we are able to square away legal, cultural, political, all of those different definitions that define us and divide us into real self-determination and real support of our own tribal ways. Because I think in a lot of cases, we pretend as if our own tribal governments always acted like this and established this way. And the realities are, they had whole different ways that they were structured and that they supported one another in the community. And we've got to work hard to not miss those lessons, not forget why our tribes behaved and thought the way they did. And, there's a lot of opportunity to fail. But if we can move forward in respectful ways, I've got high hopes for our generations to come. There'll be an advantage to being considered American Indian because, you're essentially 3 times as strong. But that means that the state and the federal government have to not only respect but also partner with our tribal governments to make sure that we're not missing the forest for the trees.
Yeah, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit. How about we discuss, you've mentioned that you partake in the powwow circuit and, the dances. Can you tell us more about your experiences with that?
Sure. I started dancing as soon as I could walk and was in the arena as a fancy dancer with my dad, powwowing my whole youth, and started attending different gatherings. And sometimes they would have stomp dances kind of after the powwow was over, and we would see how some of our other relatives would dance. So, like I said, we've been connected to a number of different tribes in this kind of intertribal way of living. And through that, I became family with a lot of good singers, and some of the most amazing song makers, composers, and kind of historical robots being able to pull these different things out, and really became interested in singing at the drum, and was able to start participating that way, which a lot of times is really misunderstood about what that drum is and what it means to our folks, and the responsibilities of it. So in those different opportunities, I became able to dance a couple of different styles, and then I was brought in here in Missouri as a tail dancer for the Omaha dance, the traditional dance. And I moved into that dance style about 13 years old. And at that point, I started being asked to be head boy dancer or head teen dancer, and grew up a little bit more and head man dancer. And then people start asking me to be an arena director and kind of take charge of things in the arena. And then all of a sudden I had an uncle pass away, and the family came and asked me to take his spot as a master of ceremonies, as a speaker. And I got the opportunity to learn and work with Archie Mason, Osage Nation down in Oklahoma. One of the best powwow voices there has been, ever will be, along with some other amazing MCs, Steve Kinder, who lives here in Kansas City, Sammy Tokiawa White in Oklahoma, Ruben Littlehead over in Kansas, by way of Montana, and a lot of different folks that have been able to get to know. So over the past 20 years or so, I've been asked to run dances and go different places to help put on these different powwows and other dances, and really enjoy that part of my life, and enjoy visiting our relatives down in Creek Country and Shawnee Country, even over at the Cherokees with their stomp dances, and going to their ceremonial grounds, and really appreciate that, and the hand games down in Carnegie, Oklahoma, and tournaments that they have around different places. So if there's a powwow and we can make it all my kids dance, and we love hitting that powwow trail. So
yeah, could you tell us maybe something maybe a little bit more specific behind like a meaning of, like, let's say a dance, or maybe something about like regalia that maybe people aren't really aware of?
Well, yeah, I think in a lot of cases people think Indians, they put on these things, adorn ourselves with these things, and then participate like you could go to a store, buy it, and then learn it and go do it. And I think we get into a place where these dances, they come from and are, sacred. Um, what becomes interesting sometimes is when people don't realize that life is sacred, that life is a ceremony. So when we get together and we have fun, sometimes it may appear one moment like like a circus with people laughing and having fun and joking around, and the next second it turns into kind of a funeral feel, and there's a real reverence, so it's alive, and our dances are alive, and that's going back to Archie and um, geez, I think back on all the names that I could try to drop on how important things have been here in my life and my development. But I think what it comes down to is that kind of respect for life is often misunderstood in our dances. And even a name like a war dance is misinterpreted to really fit stereotypes versus, really piecing apart what these ceremonies and these things take at. So there are big differences between ceremonies and powwows, differences between benefit dance and graduation dance and celebrating something. And then there's, of course, these huge, massive blowouts where, hundreds of thousands of dollars are on the line for competitions, and it's like the national rodeo finals. So, there's a lot of it to it. And again, I highlight the fact that in a lot of ways, these songs, these dances, they come from particular tribes. They didn't originate with the Ottawas. There's not an Ottawa around that ever dressed and danced like I do. But my relationship with the Omaha and the relationship with different ones from different tribes that comes from opened that door for me. Could I have just decided I wanted to be a dancer that way and gone out there? Yeah. But I think when you do that and you jump in feet first, in a lot of cases, you're not using your eyes, just using the bottom of your feet. And then I want to make sure that, our Ponkas, Omahas, a lot of the folks that kept these things or were given it, the call gave some of their things to the Osage, and the Osage are taking care of it and keeping it going. But within that, I think is a real lesson in respecting where things come from. And that's where our dances and the differences between them and how we actually interject and interact sometimes is missed. Just, people don't understand what they're even not understanding. So
you mentioned that, certain dances and, certain aspects that you may see within a powwow, people may want to associate like that as being with all tribes. Do you feel like you have had to explain to people that, hey, like this wasn't something that was traditional with this particular tribe, and this, it's something that's different, or they kind of pick that up from just going to powwows,
Yeah, I think to answer that question, I kind of have to blow it back to the bottom line, which is the majority of people, majority of my interactions with anybody is an educational session for that other person, because there's just so much not known. And sometimes people think they know, and when they talk about things, they do it with a good heart and good intention, but we get to a place where what you call me, Indian, Native American, Indigenous, those things are the first level. But what you call me as, Kiowa, Comanche, Ottawa, well, going down from that, Ottawa's not how we call ourselves. Adawa, that's where we come from that way, but that's not even how we really phrase it, in Anishinaabe, who we are as people. And I think we, at times, forget that we need that education ourselves, and that we need to give that education freely, in certain ways that, I think in my heart, if people just knew, they just understood kind of this situation, things would be all different. And our struggles that our tribes have would no longer be struggles. But within that same breath, we have some tribes that are doing amazing, and their business interests and their gaming interests and their energy resources and their fishing. There's a lot of different things that are also really good. So with good comes bad, and there's balance in it all. And I think that education is both ways, because we got Indians coming out and we got non-Indians coming towards. And at some place, we're going to have to find a way to connect in a good way and start recognizing the value the Indian people have and the lessons that can be learned, and do that in a respectful way that advances all of us. Because I think that's part of that feeling. I see that meme every time something goes bad, it comes up. Everybody says, kind of like this place was built on an Indian burial mound. I kind of like that. I don't want to like it, but I kind of like that, because at some level we are connected by this land. We're connected by being here in this beautiful place that we're at. And we as humans, we get in the way so much of what nature probably could take care of just fine. And I think what we need to do is find the natural way to unite and to learn and to bridge. But with that comes a amount of respect, and it's difficult getting respect from people that have only a cartoon image or an understanding because we're upset of things. And times we get upset of things, then that's the only time you hear of us. Columbus Day, the only time you hear of us. Indigenous People Day, we're pushing it. We don't like Columbus and the cancel culture and all of that going on. And people just kind of stepped back and thought, how would you like it if someone treated your folks like this? And really came to that place of, what bias did I come with as an Indian? What bias that you came with as a non-Indian? Where can we put those at the door and be honest in here with where we're at? But it's a jurisdictional nightmare sometimes, but only mirrored by personal identity and some of our natives feeling bad that those things that make them Indian aren't in their lives. Mm-hmm. They may not understand that those things died off for a period because they had to, but they're not dead. Rebirth. Our folks will come together, and you're not lost, and our blood, it's going to find its way. And right now, it's just making its way throughout the world, all over. And when it comes together like that, then we're going to find a way to work together and be good, no matter what color the outside of us has. So that's the hope.
So, what challenges have you faced, living in an urban setting? One area I discussed with another individual was, because they're from the Kansas City area, was, dealing with the mascot issue with the Kansas City Chiefs. What kind of similar issues have you dealt with living in urban area in Kansas City?
Say I'm very supportive of, the proper representation of Indian people and the not appropriating the culture and all of that. So when it comes to the mascots and that kind of stuff, would I call it a challenge? Probably, but I think the bigger challenge that I end up having growing up in an urban center and an urban place is what it means to actually be Indian and live that way. So, I lived in near Raytown for a while and went to college in Oklahoma and lived in Oklahoma for a period and then moved back up here and lived on Country Club Plaza, a little cheap apartment. And if I burned cedar, it would set off the smoke alarms in the hallway. If I tried to do certain practices around it, it was a difficult place to do it, to get out of the noise. And moved to Waldo area, got closer to, nature, but not all the way there. And then had a kid and had to, kind of move close to my folks. And now we're in the suburbs, but, it's still, a little bit difficult to do all of it. And, fast forward 15, 20 years, I finally have got a place here in Liberty where I have a sweat lodge in my backyard. And I had to move just to a place outside where I could have an open burn so that I could heat those rocks and be able to have that sweat lodge with my dad and my family here to take care of ourselves. So, I'll say it's been a challenge to live in an urban setting without the ability to utilize, something as fundamental to us as a sweat lodge. But we would have to drive 3 hours, 3.5 hours to go take part in a ceremony like that. Whereas now my kids, we can just go here out back. And it took a long time before I was in a place where I could actually get a spot that I could do this. So, I think sometimes we don't even recognize the fact that some of our laws and codes and just natural things are barriers to our own religious freedoms. And that it really has little to do with, somebody oppressing or holding me down, and more to do with lack of resources and ability to do. And other folks, they don't have to do that. There's a church every block, 3, 4 churches every block. And, they have ways that they handle their stuff too. So, challenges, yes. Barriers, not forever. Not forever. So,
you talk about, practices, things that you do, in connection to your culture. Do you find yourself, is there any like new things that you are learning, like as of right now? Like for instance, like as for myself, like I'm trying to get more connected with the plant relatives. So I'm trying to learn more about, the plants around me that I was taught was viewed and, as being like weeds, but actually, they have medicinal, purposes, or, they're viewed as food. Do you have any, new practices or things that you're learning?
I'm actively working on languages, trying to get better on some of my own tribe's languages, but also understand the songs that I sing from other tribes, be able to know what I'm putting out there that way. So when you said that, it made me think of my sister who talked about our descendancy, where we came from. And she said, I was at a time where they knew how to eat things. They knew how to eat. And he was over 6 foot tall, and like she was implying that he ate a certain way that made him almost a giant. And she's short as it is, so everybody's a giant to her, but in our minds anyway, was just really taking ownership of our own powers, what we put in our mouth, what we say out of it. 2 of the things that we can control, and being able to take from our plants and our animals in the right way, and in a balanced approach. That's kind of my goal. But when it comes to taking on new projects, understanding federal policy and tribal self-determination, it takes most of my time.
Yeah, I bet when you go down that alley, yeah, I can see like that. Yeah, it takes a lot of time. So, I don't want to take up too much more time. You know, you're a busy guy and everything. You know, you got to get back to the family and stuff.
I hear kids running over me all day. So, yeah, I need to
Um,
make it back up to them. But I'm more than willing to, as you process through and think of things, if there are drill downs or questions or thoughts, I by no means am an expert.
mhm.
Um, I'm almost, I'm not almost, I'm humbled and embarrassed to speak on behalf of Indian people. Um, Especially as an orphan, especially working with our Indian foster kids. So this is a responsibility that is not lost on me, and not trying to pretend or even act as if I am more than I am. But within the conversations, I know that there are children out there in Missouri that have been told they're Indian, but they don't know. They know there's a feeling there. They know there's differences, but they can't put their finger on it. And back home, I've never known us to turn anybody away from our camp. If we're having ceremony, if we're having an American church meeting, if we're doing anything, it's just not our way to turn people away. But I do think at certain points, visitors distract. And I think it's a really important time for us as Indian people to work together and unite for those kids right now that have been out there and have grown up knowing and may have a memory or two or understand they got family somewhere, but haven't been able to put um, breath to that. So I think the ones that are going to solve a lot of our problems, they're just being born. They don't even know that we're burdening them with the history of Indian policy and what it means to be an Indian in Missouri. But what I have a feeling is there's going to be Indian born in Missouri will show up here as generations continue on and make a way for positive things for our whole country, our whole world. And I just look forward for that day and time to come that they understood we did the best we could with what we had right now. And it's really our generations to come that we're working for. So I look to help understand how to define success in a non-Indian dominant world. Um, and I think in a lot of ways, there's more things that we agree upon than disagree. But I often wonder who's paying attention to what side and if we're really connecting. So, that's where it comes from, is how do we live this life like a ceremony? Understand that it's sacred. Every step we take is a gift and a responsibility, not only for us, but to the rest of us. So, as I walk through these places around Kansas City and, think about who was here before, I have a hard time feeling like we're honoring that legacy as good as we could. So, if there's opportunities that we can learn from the past, then I really hope that we do. And like I said, I really appreciate the center and the university for having this thought and this feeling and trying to do something good and unite um, all people of Missouri during this month that we recognize our Native American heritage or our indigenous people's heritage or our native skin way. I don't know how you want to say it, but the challenges are many, but the beauty of our tribal people is immeasurable. Immeasurable.
Well, Neil, yeah, thank you for taking time out to share all your experiences and sharing, who you are, sharing a little bit about your family and your culture. So I appreciate that.
I hope you and your family, all the folks at the center, and the ones that are working day to day may never make it on camera like us here, but I really want you to share back with them how much I appreciate their efforts. Um, maybe someday my kids will look back and they'll be able to see that we were doing what we could and talking good for them. And Mari and Ava and Jake and Jace, they are why I'm here. To be their father and to take care of them. And it just so happens that I get to balance these different cultural and political definitions while we're doing it. So, like I said, I'm honored that the Indian people of Kansas City, they took me in when I was an orphan. So.
Sounds good.
All right, man. All right. Thank you, Eric.
All right. Thank you, Neil. All right.
Bye-bye.
All right. We'll see you later. All right, and for our audience, we have other segments sharing other stories from other Indigenous people who live in Missouri. Please check those out and take care.